So what's going on, guys? DIY Dan here, and this is another episode of Backroads Arizona Mechanical. And in this video, I'm going to be installing a fuel transfer tank toolbox combination and installing the fuel pump and wiring it in. I'm going to show you two different options of how you can wire it in. Now, since my fuel pump was going to be inside the toolbox locked up, I went ahead and wired mine to a constant power. However, I am going to show you how to wire in a relay to do a key on power, basically for anti-theft in case your fuel transfer pump is exposed. Or if you're having a hard time finding a key on power, I'm going to show you how to replace that with a rocker switch and accomplish the same thing. Now, I will be installing this setup on my 2017 Chevy 2500 with DURAMAX, but you can use these same concepts to install this setup on any vehicle. As far as the fuel tank toolbox combo that I bought is a better built, and I got it from Tractor Supply. But once again, it doesn't matter the brand or style of tank it is, because the concept for mounting all those is about the same as well. So obviously this is a pretty long video, guys, because there is a lot of information. So if you're only interested in part of what I've got going on in this video, here is a timeline to break down so you can fast forward through what you don't need to watch. So if you enjoy this video and it gives you some good information, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. The whole concept of my channel is to give you guys the most information in the least amount of time as possible, so I don't waste your time. So let's get to it. As far as the fuel pump I got, guys, it's a FILL-RITE, 15 gallons per minute, 12 volt. Now, there are two main brands to this, FILL-RITE and GPI. And with my experience over the last 20 years, I just feel the FILL-RITE is a little bit more reliable and I like the design better. So right here, I'm just removing the 4 bolts that hold the neck to the pump, so I can put the pickup tube on the neck. So I've seen a lot of people struggle with how to put plumber's tape on correctly without it peeling off or getting frustrated during the process. And I will have a video posted at the end of this one if you want to check that out. So right here, I'm just applying the plumber's tape to the pickup tube and threading the pickup tube onto the neck and tightening it down with a couple pairs of channel locks. You'll notice right here, and you might have the same problem with your tank, is the tank is too shallow to let the pickup tube go all the way down in the tank. So what I did is I took a tape measure and measured to the top of the threads, and I've got about 12 inches there. Then I put the tape measure about 3/4 of the way up on the threads on the filler neck and marked the tube at about 12 inches. Then using a hacksaw, I cut the pickup tube at about a 15-degree angle. You do not want to be perfectly flat, because then you might sit flat against the bottom of the tank and not be able to suck any fuel out. The other thing that was wrong with this pickup tube, and I've been dealing with FILL-RITE pumps for over 20 years now, and I've never had this problem, is they actually forgot to punch the holes out of the bottom pickup tube. Here is one that is correct. Now, lucky for me, I was cutting that part of the pickup tube off anyways, so it didn't really matter. So the metal pickup tubes are all FILL-RITE, and that plastic one on the right is a GPI, and they just cut it at an angle. They go a little bit more drastic. I don't really think you need to have much more than a 15-degree angle, because the more of an angle you put on that pickup tube, the less fuel you're going to be able to pump out of that tank, because as soon as that pickup tube gets an air gap, it's going to stop being able to suck the fuel. So for example, the tank I've got is a 62-gallon capacity, but I'll probably only be able to have a usable amount of about 55, maybe 58. And that's because that 15-degree angle, as soon as it gets that air, it is going to leave a couple gallons on the bottom of the tank that it's not going to be able to use. So the bigger the angle you put on, the less amount of fuel you're going to be able to get out of the tank. Now, I cut my tube a little bit short just because I didn't want it rubbing on the bottom of the tank. However, if you wanted to get the absolute maximum amount of fuel out of your tank, you could put the neck in the tank first, tighten it down, mark how far the threads go into place, and that would give you a more accurate measurement when you go to cut the pickup tube. Using some sandpaper, I cleaned the inside and outside to take any rough edges off of the tube. Then I cleaned the inside and outside of the tube to keep any metal shavings from the cut from making it into the tank. After putting pipe tape on the neck, I went ahead and screwed that down into place in the tank. I do like to snug this down pretty good so it does not walk over time. And make sure you time it to where you want the pump to sit as well. So the next step was to wire in the pump. So on this pump, there was 2 Torx screws that took off the cover for the wiring. Then I screwed the plastic fitting in that will tighten down on the cord to produce a watertight seal, and tightened it down as well. I trimmed off the outer sheathing of the 2-wire cord that comes with the pump kit and cut the extra insulation in there as well. Then I fed that through the waterproof fitting and into the pump housing. Stripped the wires so I could put butt connectors on. The kit will come with wire nuts. I'm just not a huge fan of those, so I used butt connectors with heat shrink over the top of them. Now I always recommend using a really good crimper. If you don't have this good of a crimper, I would just recommend doing a double crimp, and always give your wire connections a good tug to make sure they do not pull out. If they do, your crimp wasn't good enough. Then using a lighter, I tightened the heat shrink against the wire. Now obviously, if this pump had been in any type of fuel or had been used before, this would not be the recommended way to go. Then I pulled some of the wire back, making sure to keep the sheathing where the nut on the plastic fitting tightens down on it, and that's what produces that waterproof seal. Then curled the wires up in the housing, put it in place, and started the bolts, making sure not to pinch any of the wires between the housing and the cover. Then I went ahead and tightened those down. Then I placed the fuel pump on the pickup tube and put the 4 bolts in that held the pickup tube to the pump and tightened those down. Then I put plumber's tape on the 90-degree elbow that goes into the top of the pump, tightened it down. Now something I highly recommend doing that does not come in your fuel pump kit is putting an auxiliary fuel filter housing. I actually got mine at Tractor Supply for about 17 bucks, and I had to get a couple pipe reduced fittings because it was a 1-inch housing and my hose and pump is only 3/4 inch. This will keep any debris that accumulates on the bottom of your transfer tank to making it into anything you're filling up with fuel. So I pipe taped those, put those into place using a vise to hold the filter housing while doing so, and went ahead and put the hose together and the fuel nozzle. Now I did get the kit that comes with the automatic shutoff because I'm not a big fan of standing around and holding the handle. Now if you do decide to put this extra fuel housing on, you will need an extra male-to-male 3/4 inch nipple to attach the two. So right here I put pipe tape on that, put that into place. Now the fuel filter housing will have a direction, so make sure you pay attention. It will either have a set of arrows to tell you which direction it's flowing or just say in and out on the housing. Almost all filters are made so the dirty fluid comes in around the outside of the filter because there's a lot more surface area of media to catch it, and leaves through the center of the filter. If you reverse the filter, you're not going to get nearly the amount of life out of your fuel filter. Now I actually used a Baldwin filter BF 955, but there are several different manufacturers, and Tractor Supply had a fuel filter right by the housing as well. So I shifted the elbow so I could get the fuel filter on and have it in a nice location, and tighten the filter down by hand. Then I went ahead and pipe taped my hose assembly and put that on as well. Now most likely with these setups, your first point of failure is going to be your hose, and 99% of the time it's going to be right after your pump or fuel filter housing because of the weight on the hose and the bend it produces. This holds especially true when your pump and hose is exposed to the sun, not covered up in a toolbox. So what I did to correct this problem, even though mine is in a toolbox, is I put an extra 90-degree elbow. So the normal position that this hose sits all the time is in a nice relaxed position with no abrupt bends. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on mounting the toolbox because it is kind of self-explanatory. You want to make sure you're centered side to side, and make sure your toolbox lids are going to open and close nicely with no obstruction. Now most toolbox or transfer tanks are going to come with mounting holes on the side of the tank and in the back. Coming from somebody who's dealt with these tanks for over 20 years at work, you really don't need to use both sets of mounting holes. You could either use one or the other. I chose to use the ones on the side just so I didn't have to look at them. Plus the fact that I drove around for about 2 weeks with this transfer tank in the back of my truck without bolting it down, and it never really moved. All you're trying to do with these mounting bolts is basically hold it from shifting side to side or front to back. Besides that, they're basically for an anti-theft. Now this is the first time I've ever used these type of studs with isolator bushings basically, and that is basically for flex. So I put the toolbox centered where I wanted it, went ahead and drilled down with leaving the toolbox in place because I was able to get my drill next to it. You could mark the holes, pull the toolbox out of the way, and then drill them. I do recommend looking underneath the bed where you think the holes are going to be to make sure you're not going to hit any fuel lines. Or in my case, since I was using the bolts on the side, I was really close to the air compressor for my airbags. The other thing I highly recommend is putting a piece of hose, tubing, or even wrapping up electrical tape on the drill bit so it only lets it penetrate so far once it cuts through the material. This is coming from personal experience on a 2001 brand new F550. The drill bit caught as soon as it went through that thin sheet metal, sucked it all the way down to the drill, and I went right through a fuel line on a brand new truck. And that was the first and last time that has ever happened to me. So the best way to install these studs would have been to remove the bed liner, bolt the studs to the bed, then put the bed liner over top, set the toolbox on top of that, and then put the bushings, washers, and nuts. However, because the way I mounted my fifth wheel rails, I would have had to unbolt those as well to get the bed liner out. So because of that reason, I ended up just putting the studs on top of the bed liner, placing the fuel tank on top of that, putting the rubber isolators, washers, nuts, tightening those down first, then going underneath and tightening down the nuts under the bed until they were snug. And once again, I'm not really worried about it just because of the fact these are only here to keep it from sliding front to back or side to side. Then I drilled one more 1/2-inch hole so I could run the wiring down through the bed as well. You can just run it over the bed between the cab and the bed. I've just never liked the way that looked, so that's why I decided to drill an extra hole. So right here is a glance of the wiring going through the side of the toolbox. They do give you a little plastic plug that you can drill through, so I went ahead and did that so I had a nice tight fit. Then I ran it down the side of the toolbox and through the hole I made. As far as running the wiring up to the front of the truck, I try and find a wiring harness that is pre-existing and just zip tie it along with that harness all the way to the front of the vehicle. Especially since my fuel tank was on the passenger side, which is the same side as the exhaust. So if that harness is safe from the exhaust, then I know my harness will be as well. So being as though my truck has a DURAMAX, I've got a battery on each side. So I was able to run my harness to that passenger side battery. Right here, I had to take the reinforcement bar off that's over the top of the battery so I could access it. So the one bolt for this bar is underneath a piece of trim between the hood and the fender that you will have to remove. Once getting that off, there is a plastic cover that unsnaps off of there so you can access the power distribution. So I'm not a huge fan of the way butt connectors look underneath my hood. So right here, I'm just using a lighter to heat up the plastic around the butt connector so I could remove it. Now I'm crimping that butt connector onto my inline fuse that I'm using with a nice heavy gauge wire that matches the same size as the wiring going to the pump. And then I'm using a piece of black heat shrink and I'm going to melt that on top of the butt connector to give it a nice clean look. Once again, making sure you tug on that wire after you do the crimp to make sure it's not loose, because the loose connection is going to lead to resistance, which creates heat and could also shorten the life of your transfer pump. So I ended up loosening the nut that holds the battery cable to the bus bar and put my eyelet on that stud and tightening that back down. So you should take the grounds off of both of your batteries so you have no chance of shorting the ground during this process, even though I did not. I went ahead and put the plastic cover back on and snapped into place after getting that in. I do not have the fuse in the inline fuse holder to prevent shorting the ground during this process, and went ahead and put that extra support bar back into place and tightened those down as well. Then I stripped the wiring back on my red wire coming from the fuel pump and put a piece of heat shrink over it. Now for my butt connectors, I get the ones that don't have any insulation on them. I actually got mine at the Lighthouse in Phoenix, Arizona. Or like a Granger would probably have them. Your basic automotive stores probably will not. I connected that red wire to my inline fuse, butt connected that, put some heat shrink over it. For my ground, I was looking for something that I could ground to the chassis, but I didn't really find anything, so I did put an eyelet on that black wire and just put it directly to the nut that holds the ground on the battery itself and tightened it back down. Then gave my wire a good tug to make sure it was tight, and also wiggled the battery cable to make sure it was tight as well. Then I put my 30 amp fuse in the inline holder and put a zip tie and held the wire in a good location that was easily accessible. So I've seen a lot of people use these automatic resetting circuit breakers for your fuel pump. The thing I don't like about that is if you do create a short in the wire going back to the fuel pump, it's going to kick that circuit breaker on and off until either the breaker goes bad or the wire gets burned out. However, when I was looking for a picture of that auto resetting circuit breaker, I did come across this circuit breaker, which has a manual reset. So if it does trip it, you have to manually reset it before it will supply power again, which is the same concept as a fuse, except it is resettable. Now, I knew they had this style of circuit breaker, but I was unaware they went all the way down to 30 amps. The ones that I had seen were upwards of 150 to 200 amps. So this is probably the way I would have gone if I would have seen this before buying my inline fuse. FILL-RITE also supplies you with an extra ground wire just to take down to the chassis. So I put a large eyelet on that wire and attached it to one of the bolts that was holding an exhaust bracket to the frame. And they do have a grounding bolt on the fuel pump itself to attach it to. Alright guys, so this is going to explain how, if you want a little bit more of an anti-theft for your fuel transfer pump so nobody can walk up to it and just flip the switch and start pumping fuel, this is a way to do this with a key-on power using a relay. So right here's your battery. We're going to come off same as the constant, put an inline fuse or circuit breaker here. We're going to go to pole 30 on your basic 12 volt relay. Then we're going to take pole 87 and bring it over to the power for the fuel pump. Pole 86 is going to go to ground. And then you're going to need to find a key on power. Usually you can get that out of the fuse block, either in the cab or under the hood. And you're going to take that key on power and go to pole 85 on the relay. So how that's going to work is, if you have your key in accessory position, it's going to supply 12 volts here. Excite this relay and allow pole 30 to transfer 12 volts over to pole 87, which in turn will give you power to your fuel pump so you can operate it. Without that key on power to the exciter, it will not allow this 12 volts to transfer to pole 87, and therefore it will not allow your fuel pump to work. So if you decide to go this route, you can get these relays on Amazon. I always like to get one that is weatherproof, and make sure the wire size on pole 30 and 87 is at least the same size or bigger than that on the fuel pump. As far as finding the key on power, the first place to always look is in your owner's manual under the fuse and location. I had an ignition run power feed. This was on my 2001 F250, and it was inside the cab. Or if you don't have the owner's manual, is just grab a voltmeter. I got this one off of Amazon for about 10 bucks, or a test light, and test your fuses one by one to see if you get a 12 volt power when you turn the key on, but make sure it goes off when the key shuts off. And I really like these style of add a circuit. They plug into your fuse panel and just add an extra fuse with a wire coming off to run to that pole 85 exciter on your 12 volt relay. Now at work, we've noticed it is getting harder and harder to find those key on powers in the fuse block as the vehicles get newer. And if you just can't find any key on powers to run from either of your fuse panels, either under the hood or in the cab, you can put a rocker switch instead of that key on power. So I modified the diagram a little bit to show you what the difference would be if you ran a rocker switch instead of using a key on power from the fuse block. After the fuse, we're coming over and we're running battery power inside the cab of the truck to a rocker switch or toggle switch. Then coming off that toggle switch back out to pole 85 on that relay. So in order to use the fuel pump, you have to turn the toggle switch on. The only bad part about that is if you leave that toggle switch on accidentally, you might end up killing your battery. And we've done the combination of a key on and using a rocker switch as well, depending on the circumstance. So that's going to wrap this video up, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed it and it gave you some information. Once again, if so, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it, and I hope to see you next time. Have a good one. Later.